In this lecture, we're going to look at the Hindu Scriptures and Pantheon. Historically in Hinduism, there isn't anything like the Bible or the Quran. There isn't one single book that can be easily copied, that can be carried around, that most people in the religion have some chance to read, at least if they're literate. What there is instead is a vast and very diverse collection of writings with indeterminate boundaries, which are in theory more or less authoritative. Here in this chart is the whole range of Hindu scriptures. They're usually broken down into two groups, the Shruti, which means heard, and the Smriti, which means memorized. We're going to go through them now left to right and just indicate the basic nature of these writings. The first thing to say, though, is that these writings are very hard to accurately date, and this is more true the older they are. The traditional view, of course, is that the Vedas, the earliest scriptures, are eternal, that they've always been around. And, well, historians, Western and Indian, don't usually just leave it at that. They usually do think that there was a certain point in the history of humanity where these things were first written down. A very traditional dating of the Vedas would say that they were written perhaps around 2000 BC, before the Common Era. Myself, I'm more skeptical. A number of other scholars think that no Hindu text can be dated accurately before around the 1100s AD, that is, 1100s Common Era. And the reason for this is just simple lack of manuscripts, lack of physical evidence. My understanding is that the earliest physical copies we have of the Vedas are from the 1500s Common Era. If you think about that, that's really astounding. That means we would have something like 3,000 years or more of oral transmission. Either that or they were written down in copies, and because of the hot weather in India, those copies just rotted away. But in any case, the earliest physical copies we have are from the 1500s Common Era. That should make us skeptical about accurately dating the Vedas. If you ask me what the date of the Vedas is, all I'm going to say is that they're very BCE. They're from long before the Common Era. If you really press me for dates, all I can tell you is I've seen scholars give dates between 1500 BCE and 800 BCE. But as I said, I'm more skeptical than that. Theoretically, Hinduism is based on the Vedas, but as a matter of fact, they're very rarely read by ordinary Hindus. They're generally only read by scholars and by ritual specialists, people who are basically carrying out magical ceremonies using these texts. I should also give you a warning about terminology. Sometimes the term Vedas isn't used just for these 4 books that I'm talking about. Sometimes the term Vedas refers to the Vedas and the Upanishads, and sometimes the term Vedas is just used kind of indiscriminately for all Hindu scriptures, all sacred writings. But in the proper sense, the Vedas are these 4 books. They do seem to be very old just because of their contents. They're largely liturgical. They have to do with ceremonies and songs and specific ways in which you're going to worship various deities. And the pantheon there, that is the collection of deities in the Vedas, does differ somewhat from the pantheon that I'm going to introduce you to later in this lecture. Seemingly, the Vedas contain the Aryan pantheon, and the 4 books are the Rig Veda, the Sama Veda, the Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda. The remaining portions of the Shruti are obviously later than the Vedas and can be considered as a sort of commentary on the Vedas, an exercise in interpreting the Vedas. The Brahmanas are also largely liturgical, and there's one Brahmana to supplement each of the 4 Vedas. The Aranyakas, means forest books, are sort of esoteric or magical books that originated with forest retired hermits, people who dedicated themselves to living their lives in solitude in the forest, seeking some sort of enlightenment. Of these other 3, arguably the Upanishads are the most important, and these have certainly attracted far more attention by Western scholars. The reason is that they're more philosophical, they're more theoretical. They reflect in a more systematic way on the nature of the divine. So all of these books are obviously later than the Vedas, but all I'll say about them is that they're definitely BC. They're before the Common Era. Again, if you twist my arm and demand a date for the Upanishads, all I'll say is that I've seen good scholars give dates ranging from 800 BCE all the way down to 300 BCE. Let's move on then to the famous epics. The great Hindu epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, give the practical basis for a lot of Hindu religious life. The Mahabharata is the longest epic in world literature, and a small subsection of it is the Bhagavad Gita, sometimes also just called the Gita. The name Bhagavad Gita means Song of the Lord. This small subsection of the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, is the most beloved book in recent Hinduism. Interestingly, it became really popular in modern times. It was in the 19th century, so in the 1800s, that Hindus really decided to focus on this book. And some scholars speculate that this may have been a sort of reaction to the Christians and the Muslims. The Christians and Muslims did have a relatively short collection of sacred writings that one could print in one book and carry around, and which people could become familiar with fairly easily. It is, of course, an interesting and well-done book, and we'll have occasion to talk a little bit more about it later in this lecture. The Ramayana is the story of Ram, or Rama, who's the main character. It's very long, but only about 1/4 the length of the Mahabharata. This Ram, or Rama, is basically an incarnation of God. And it's a really exciting adventure story. It exists in TV series and even in a Japanese animated cartoon version from the 1990s. How old are these epics? Again, the question is difficult. There's a lack of evidence. Also, they both exist in multiple versions. They were revised many times and had things added to them at different points in their history. But at least originally, most scholars agree that these were from late BC times to early Common Era times. The Laws of Manu, or the Law Code of Manu, is probably from early Common Era. And we talked a little bit about some of the controversial elements in here relating to women. Of course, it's about a lot more than that. And finally, we have the Puranas. The Puranas are a very large collection of mythology. There are 18 parts to this collection. And the Puranas contain what is surely the greatest living body of mythological literature. Here you have the detailed stories of gods that we'll introduce you to in a minute, such as Vishnu and Shiva, as well as various goddesses. Scholars think these are basically late ancient or early medieval, so they're from somewhere in the range of 300 to 500 CE. At least that's when the earliest versions were. Probably there were a lot of additions later on in the Middle Ages. Hindus differ quite a bit in how interested they are in the Puranas and how they interpret them. On the one end, you have Hindus who do interpret them literally. They believe that these are true accounts of the life stories of these various deities and their families. At the other far end, you have Hindus who think that these are a rich set of tales that embody good ethical lessons and which are a rich part of the Indian heritage which should be passed on. But no, they don't think that these are true, that they're literally true. They might be true in the sense that they produce good behavior or something like that. And then there's probably views in the middle where Hindus will take some of them seriously and other ones not so much. Again, you have to remember that even just the Puranas are so long, it'd be difficult for one person to read them, and most people don't. Most people hear various versions of these stories in television, comic books, other kinds of literature, but as far as reading through the actual Puranas, that isn't done all that often. The last group of scriptures then are the Yoga Sutras. These are manuals of techniques and meditational exercises which are supposed to be spiritually beneficial. Americans and other Westerners now think of yoga as kind of traditional Indian stretching exercises. It does involve physical exercises, but it's not supposed to just be a way to lower stress or to improve your health. There is always a spiritual or religious aim to this literature. They're trying to help you obtain a state of pure consciousness. These seem to be early Common Era. I've seen good scholars date them from around 100 to the 500s CE. Some would say perhaps the 200 or 300 CE. So those are the scriptures of Hinduism. In the next part of this lecture, we're going to look at the Hindu pantheon as it exists today. This concerns particularly the deities who are featured in the great epics and in the Puranas.